Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading from UPSC Civil Services examination perspective. Today we'll be discussing the New Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper dated 17th November 2022, and the list of the news and timestamp has been provided in the YouTube description. Now today is Thursday and this is your practice question for mains from DNS video lectures, and this question has been taken from the DNS dated 10th November 2022, where the news on level of groundwater extraction was discussed in detail by Gaurav sir. So the mains question for your practice is, groundwater resource is highly unevenly distributed across India. Bring out the reasons for the same. Also discuss the various groundwater related issues across India and come up with suitable measures to conserve this valuable resource. And this question carries 15 marks. So go through the DNS dated 10th November 2022 to practice this particular question on mains. Let's take up this article appearing on page number 6, titled "This Unseating of Vice-Chancellor is Faulty." Now this article focuses on the issue of appointment of Vice-Chancellors. Now appointment of Vice-Chancellors are done according to the state laws, that is the State Universities Act, and also the UGC regulations of 2018 have to be followed. So the main issue highlighted in this article is that which law among these two gains primacy. Now generally according to the state university laws, it is the governor who is generally appointed as the ex officio chancellor of such state universities. And as chancellors, the governors enjoy certain statutory powers, including appointment of vice chancellors. However, regulations of UGC must also be followed. Now there are two important guidelines with respect to the UGC regulations of 2018. First is constitution of a selection committee to appoint vice chancellors, and this search committee or selection committee must suggest 3 or 5 names. So these are some of the requirements as suggested by the UGC regulations of 2018. So in the backdrop of these two important regulations provided by University Grant Commission, these two Supreme Court judgments becomes important. Now in the case of Gambhirdan K. Gadvi versus State of Gujarat, the Supreme Court quashed the appointment of a Vice Chancellor on the ground that selection committee was not constituted. The Supreme Court also held that the state university laws were repugnant to the UGC regulations of 2018. And in case of repugnancy, according to Article 254 of the Indian Constitution, it is the central law which prevails, and hence it quashed the appointment of Vice Chancellor. Further, in this particular case of Professor Srijit PS versus Dr. Rashri MS, Supreme Court observed that provisions of Search Committee and State Universities Act is repugnant to UGC regulations, according to Article 254 of the Indian Constitution. So again, the issue of supremacy of central law gains prominence with respect to Article 254 of the Indian Constitution. So here we need to understand about Article 254 of the Indian Constitution and also about the term law as has been defined under Article 13. So this article not only deals with the statutory powers of the governor with respect to state university laws, but also with respect to the federal relation or the federal balance between union and states. And accordingly under GS paper 2, this topic gets covered under salient features of the Indian constitutions and also functions and responsibilities of the union and states, along with issues and challenges pertaining to the federal structure. So in this backdrop of appointment of vice chancellors and which law gains supremacy, this article represents a critical analysis of the Supreme Court judgment, especially with respect to its understanding on repugnancy of Article 254 of the Indian Constitution. And to understand this important critical analysis, let us understand the nuances of Article 13, which defines law, and also Article 254 of the Indian Constitution. Then we will take up the critical analysis one by one as highlighted in this particular article. So the term law has been defined under Article 13, and it includes any ordinance, order, bylaw, rule, regulation, notification, custom or usage having in the territory of India the force of law. So this is the definition of law according to Article 13 of the Indian Constitution, which also forms part of fundamental right. Now let's look into the terms of Article 254. So it talks about inconsistency of laws between central and states, and at the first instance, if there is inconsistency between central law or state law, then generally in such inconsistency, it is the central law which prevails at the first instance and the state law does not prevail. And these are with respect to the matters enlisted under concurrent list. Because under the concurrent list, both the union and states are entitled to make laws. So based on this understanding, this article provides that in case of any inconsistency between central law or state law, it is the central law which prevails initially unless such inconsistency or such repugnancy is approved by the President of India. So this is what has been provided under Article 254 of the Indian Constitution. Now the point of critical analysis is the heading of Article 254. So it says that inconsistency between laws made by Parliament and laws made by legislature of states. And this article suggests that UGC regulation of 2018 is not a law made by the Parliament of India. And hence the provision of Article 254 will not apply when treating a regulation of the central government and a law made by the state government. As in such instances, then the state legislation or the state laws made by the state legislature prevails. So this is the first ground of critical analysis regarding the Supreme Court judgment, which held that in case of repugnancy, it is the central law which shall prevail, and here central law was assumed as the UGC regulations of 2018. And based on the first ground of contention or first ground of critical analysis, that is, the UGC regulations are not laws made by Parliament under Article 254. The second ground is that the state laws or legislations made by the State Legislative Assembly gain supremacy over such regulations made by the central government. So this becomes another contentious issue which, according to the author in this article, should have been re-examined by the Supreme Court. Or rather, the Supreme Court should look into the supremacy, especially between state laws passed by the Legislative Assembly of the state as compared to the executive order of the central government. Now, another ground of contention is that the rules or regulations of the central government or any of the state government does not pass through rigorous debates or through the rigors of law. And since they do not go through the intense parliamentary debates, they do not require the approval of the Parliament or, for that matter of fact, State Legislative Assembly. So in that respect, rules or regulations act subsidiary as compared to the laws either passed by Parliament or State Legislative Assembly. Further, the Supreme Court has given supremacy to an executive order of the central government, and in this regard, the article suggests that this infringes the legislative autonomy of the states under Article 246, which provides for union list, state list, and also concurrent list. And since education is under concurrent list, and hence state has equal powers along with the union to make laws on that particular subject. So another ground of contention is that Supreme Court declaring state legislations as inferior as compared to executive order of the state, this also infringes the legislative autonomy of states as provided under Article 246 of the Indian Constitution. And this is also one of the important federal features of the Indian Constitutions, and hence is a violation of federal principles of the Indian Constitution. Now another point of contention highlighted in this article is that the provisions regarding appointments of Vice-Chancellors are not provided under the UGC Act. Now the point highlighted here is that since a provision is not provided under the Parent Act, hence such regulations cannot be formed which has not been provided under the Parent Act. So it says that appointment of VCs are not provided under the UGC Act. However, the UGC regulation of 2018 provides for the process and methods of appointment of Vice-Chancellor. And the article suggests that the Parent Act, that is the UGC Act, does not provide for the appointment of Vice-Chancellors. Hence, the UGC regulations cannot provide for the same, and this is against the principles of administrative law. And hence are ultra vires the Parent Act, that is beyond the provisions of the Parent Act. So these are the grounds of contention or the critical analysis of the Supreme Court judgment, which has provided supremacy to UGC regulations of 2018 as compared to the state university laws providing for appointment of Vice-Chancellor. So as a way forward, the question becomes that what needs to be done. The article suggests that there is a need to relook into the provisions of Article 254, especially on grounds of repugnancy between an executive order of the central government and legislations passed by the state legislative assembly. And even if there is any inconsistency or repugnancy between the central law or the state law, Supreme Court should try to reconcile those laws and try to remove such inconsistency by applying doctrine of harmonious construction. As Supreme Court in S. Satyapal Reddy versus Government of Andhra Pradesh in 1994 held that every effort should be made to reconcile the conflicting provisions of the law, and the doctrine of harmonious construction must be applied whenever needed. So it says that a proper test would be whether effect can be given to provisions of both the laws or whether both the laws can stand together. And when such reconciliation is done by applying doctrine of harmonious construction, then there would be no need to strike down a state law on grounds of repugnancy. So this is what has been provided as a way forward with respect to conflict between central laws or regulations and also state laws. That is, an effort should be made towards reconciling of those laws so that both laws can stand together. Thus, this article effectively highlights on grounds of repugnancy with respect to Article 254 and also provides a critical analysis of the Supreme Court judgment, which has given supremacy to UGC regulations of 2018 as compared to the state university legislations. Let's take up this article appearing on page number 7, and its title is Quest for Transparency in FTA Negotiations. FTA stands for Free Trade Agreements. So this article basically suggests that the transparency which other governments, particularly the United Kingdom, follows in ratifying their free trade agreements, similar transparency is not being followed in India. And the entire process of ratifying or agreeing to a free trade agreement is rather done by the executive without any parliamentary control. So overall, the author in this article has suggested for more parliamentary control so that various facets of the free trade agreement can be discussed on the floor of the House in Parliament, and free trade agreement should not only be left to executive's decision or action of the executive. So there must be certain parliamentary control, and this has also been provided under Article 253 of the Indian Constitution, which mentions about legislations for giving effect to international agreements. Further, Article 51C, which is a part of Directive Principles, mentions that states shall endeavour to foster respect for international law and treaty obligations in dealings of organized peoples with one another. And Article 75, Clause 3 of the Indian Constitution effectively talks about parliamentary control over executive action, as it mentions that the Council of Ministers shall be collectively responsible to the House of the People. So this article effectively suggests that ratification of any international agreement or important treaties must be subject to parliamentary control, as is done by the United Kingdom, especially with respect to the free trade agreement. Now this topic becomes important both from the perspective of economy and also polity and governance. And for polity and governance under GS paper 2, this topic gets covered under comparison of Indian constitutional schemes with other countries. As we have seen, number of questions are being asked by UPSC of late from this particular section. So here let's go through the important highlights as to how United Kingdom exercises parliamentary control while ratifying its international agreement, including free trade agreement or other treaties. And this topic also gets covered under the important functioning and conduct of business of Parliament. So here, first of all, let us understand that what is a free trade agreement and why free trade agreements which are entered into with different countries should be put to parliamentary scrutiny as it is practiced in United Kingdom or other countries. Now generally two countries enter into FTA or free trade agreement between one another to improve their exports. And as a part of free trade agreement between two countries, it reduces or eliminates customs duty on most of the goods and services which are traded between these two countries. So suppose, for example, both countries A and B enters into FTA or free trade agreement with respect to manufacturing of automobile parts agricultural and dairy products, and also drug cosmetics. So for all these three or various products, both countries will agree to a minimal customs duty or eliminate customs duty altogether. However, there might be certain other goods or services which are also exchanged or traded between the countries A and B, and if these goods and services are put under the negative list, then the customs duty remains the same. So free trade agreements generally have a far-reaching impact on the economy and also on the society. And because of its greater impact on the economy and also society, one expects greater transparency and scrutiny of the FTA process during and after the negotiations. Now, free trade agreements have various benefits, and this is because of which various countries enters into free trade agreement in order to provide its exporters easy market access. So free trade agreement between different countries allows their exporters to get preferential treatment as compared to non-FTA members. Now suppose countries A, B, C, D and E have a free trade agreement on number of goods and services. So the exporters from these different countries can export among themselves on reduced tariff or lower tariffs as compared to any other country, say for example F, G or H. And this preferential treatment also provides price competitiveness and ensures more earnings for the exporters of the countries of free trade agreement. Now let's understand this through an example. Now ASEAN has a free trade agreement with India, but ASEAN does not have free trade agreement with Canada. So how does this help Indian exporter? So the customs duty on leather shoes is 20%, but since ASEAN have a FTA with India, India has reduced the customs duty of leather shoes to 0. So Indian exporters who are exporting leather shoes to ASEAN countries will export under 0 customs duty or no customs duty, whereas exporters of leather shoes from Canada will export their leather shoes to ASEAN countries under a higher tariff or under a higher customs duty. So this makes the Indian exporters of leather shoes more price competitive as compared to the exporter of leather shoes from Canada, and this also gives more earnings to the Indian exporters. And through these free trade agreement, it also protects the local exporters from losing out to foreign competitors which might receive preferential treatment under other free trade agreements. So these can be said to be some of the overall benefits of free trade agreements for the society at large, particularly the Indian exporters. And it is because of this large impact of free trade agreements between different countries, the article has suggested for more scrutiny of the process which is followed to ratify a free trade agreement. And it is here where the comparative analysis comes into picture with respect to the scrutiny of these free trade agreements as done in India as compared to what is being followed in United Kingdom. Now let's look into these questions asked by UPSC in successive years. This year in the mains of 2022, the question was critically examine the procedures through which the presidents of India and France are elected, and this question carried 15 marks. Last year in 2021, the question was, to what extent in your view Parliament is able to ensure accountability of the executive in India? It was a 10-marker question. And in the year 2020, the question was, the judicial systems in India and UK seems to be converging as well as diverging in recent times. Highlight the key points of convergence and divergence between the two nations in terms of their judicial practices. This question also carried 10 marks. So we see a number of questions have been asked both from the perspective of comparative constitution and also on the functioning of Parliament in order to ensure accountability of the executive. And in this backdrop, let us go through the process of free trade agreement negotiations which is followed in United Kingdom and also a comparative analysis with India. So in the first step, the Department of International Trade of United Kingdom publishes a policy paper providing for the following. So the policy paper provides for strategic objectives behind the negotiation for the FTA agreement, importance for the UK as a country to have such FTA with the other country. Further, the policy paper must also provide various impacts of FTA with respect to economic gains expected, distributional impacts in the society, environmental impact, labor and human rights dimensions, etc. So various dimensions or various aspects with respect to the FTA agreement needs to be provided in a policy paper which is published. Now this is where the practice in India differs. As in India, no such policy paper is published. So in India, no such policy paper is published which extensively provides not only the strategic objectives of the free trade agreement but also the various impacts because of which India intends to enter into such free trade agreement with other countries. Further, in India, the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, which is the nodal body or the nodal ministry dealing with free trade agreements, only provides bare minimum information about free trade agreements on its website. The next step followed in UK is that the DFIT paper, that is the policy paper published by Department of International Trade of United Kingdom, also provides for inputs from important stakeholders. These important stakeholders includes business organizations, non-governmental organizations and also other stakeholders including those businesses in the sectors in which FTA is about to be entered. And suppose if any stakeholders has provided certain suggestion or given a contrary view, then the government also counters it or provides for a specific view on such suggestions from the stakeholders. Now in India also, the Ministry of Commerce and Industry undertakes stakeholder consultations and also interministerial meetings. But again, these stakeholders consultations or these interministerial meetings are not published. So these suggestions, even provided by the industry experts, are not in public domain. The third important step which takes place in UK is proper scrutiny of the FTA agreement by the UK Parliament or the Parliament of United Kingdom. So the third point is scrutiny by International Agreements Committee of UK Parliament. So just like in India, we have various parliamentary committees and the department related parliamentary committees. The Parliament of UK has a specific committee to look into international agreements known as International Agreements Committee, referred here as IAC. So it says that the IAC of the British Parliament hears expert witnesses on the FTA if they have any doubt regarding any provisions of the free trade agreement. So they call on the experts and ask their suggestions. They critically examine government's strategic objective for each FTA under negotiation. And the committee also offers important suggestions wherever it finds any gaps. So if the committee feels that there is any lacuna or there is any gap with respect to any point or any negotiation, then the committee also provides for its recommendation. And based on the recommendation provided by the International Agreements Committee of UK Parliament, the Government of United Kingdom has to respond to such suggestions provided by the committee. So this makes the whole ratification of the treaty more transparent and more controlled by the British Parliament. Now if we compare this practice of parliamentary scrutiny of UK as compared to India, then we find that in the past hardly any parliamentary scrutiny have been done. And even the department related Parliamentary Standing Committee on Commerce rarely scrutinizes any of the international agreements, particularly the objectives behind signing such free trade agreement. And the fourth important point highlighted here is that the treaty in UK is laid before British Parliament before ratification. However, no such precedent exists in India. So in United Kingdom, according to the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act of 2010, the executive has to lay down a treaty before British Parliament for 21 sitting days along with an explanatory memorandum before the ratification of the treaty. And this ensures parliamentary scrutiny and control over the action of the executive. Now again, if we compare with respect to the process followed in India, then in India, the executive does not lay down the policy before parliament for its approval before ratification. So it is based on this the author suggests that there is a need to develop a new law on entering treaties including free trade agreements. So the government of India should enact a new law which should provide for elaborate process for parliamentary control over the action of the executive, including ratification of free trade agreements. And the author suggests that India should follow all these important steps which is followed in United Kingdom, as this will allow greater parliamentary control even for ratifying international agreements by the executive. And since it is the duty of the parliament to ensure accountability of the executive, the process should not be any different for ratification of international treaties or agreements. Now let's take up these two news appearing on page number 6 and page number 10 respectively. And this news is regarding India's upcoming presidency of G20. So the editorial title is getting ready. India during its G20 presidency needs to bring all nations in line with its vision. And this news on page number 10 highlights that India's G20 presidency will be all inclusive, ambitious, decisive, and also action oriented. And during its presidency, India has also stated that it would give priority to women-led development on its G20 agenda, which would be driven by the recently unveiled theme of One Earth, One Family, and One Future. Now, India's presidency, which begins on 1st of December 2022, comes at a time when the world faces economic hardships and also recessionary trends globally. So during India's presidency, there would be various concerns which India need to look into, particularly the geopolitical tensions between Russia and NATO allies. Further, India also needs to look into the aspect of slowdown and also the aspect of rising food and energy prices as people across the world are facing economic hardship also because of disruption in supply chain due to Ukraine-Russia war. Further, India also will have to look into the long-term ill effects of the COVID pandemic. So these are the concerns during which India takes up the presidency of G20 in December 2022 and later the SCO in 2023. Now this G20 summit in Bali in Indonesia provided some positive signals as the G20 members were able to produce a joint statement which was not expected earlier. And India's role in tempering some of the language during negotiations must also be highlighted, as the statement given by the Prime Minister of India that today's era must not be that of war but that of peace has echoed in the joint statement of G20. Now another gesture extended by Indian Prime Minister Modi to Chinese President Xi Jinping during the banquet is in contrast to their earlier stony demeanor at the SCO summit in September. Now this signals maturity and pragmatic behavior on part of India as it is about to take up G20's presidency. So Indian Prime Minister extending his hand to Chinese President must be seen as future cooperation not only in G20 but also in SCO. Further, on the sidelines of the G20 meet in Bali, Indian Prime Minister also held meetings separately with the leaders of Australia, France, Germany, Italy, Singapore and also United Kingdom. So with the PM of United Kingdom, that is Rishi Sunak, Indian Prime Minister raised the issues of trade, mobility, defence and security while discussing about India-UK Free Trade Agreement. Now with Italy, Indian Prime Minister focused on deepening cooperation in the field of energy, defence, culture and also efforts to combat climate change and boosting economic partnership. Further, the Green Partnership on Renewable Energy was also discussed between India and Italy. Further, in his meeting with the French President, Prime Minister of India focused on the defence partnership and also discussed about the civil nuclear cooperation pertaining to the much delayed Jeetapur nuclear power plant. Further, the Indian Prime Minister with ASEAN leaders discussed ASEAN-India partnership, bilateral ties with the ASEAN members, and also increasing investment in the field of fintech industry, renewable energy, skill development, health and also pharmaceutical sectors. So as India moves into the presidency of G20 in December and later the presidency of SCO, various geopolitical and other concerns needs to be addressed, including geopolitical tensions, economic slowdown, rising food and energy prices, long-term effects of the pandemic, terrorism, including use of technology, issues of climate change, gender inequality and also other challenges pertaining to cyber security. India needs to be pragmatic in its approach and needs to onboard members of G20 and also Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And accordingly, the editorial concludes by saying that to achieve this, New Delhi will have to bring on board all countries with its vision for the forum's future, steering the world's economic leadership through this difficult phase, and preparing for future perils, including climate change and global warming, food and energy shortages, terrorism and conflict, and also bridging the digital divide. So it is a proud moment for India to host the presidency of G20 from December and later the presidency of SCO, but along with it will also come various challenges and concerns. So this article becomes important from the perspective of GS paper 2 under the subheading of global groupings. Let's take up this news, which is mainly important from your prelims perspective, appearing on page number 10. And this news is regarding Moscow format. So the news highlights that India participates in Moscow talks on forming an inclusive government in Afghanistan. The news further says that the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan and the Moscow talks focuses on the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, and also efforts to provide assistance were also discussed. So what we need to know is about Moscow format consultations, and this consultation is regarding Afghanistan and also to ensure peace and reconciliation in Afghanistan. So it says that this Moscow format consultations is one of the several dialogue platforms on Afghanistan which began before the Taliban takeover of Kabul. The Moscow format was set up in the year 2017 as a six-party mechanism which involved Russia, India, Afghanistan, Iran, China and Pakistan. Later, the membership was expanded, and now the group also consists of Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan and also Turkmenistan. And the purpose is to establish peace in Afghanistan through reconciliation. Now, talking about the present meeting, India also joined the latest meeting of Moscow format consultations in Afghanistan, which was held in Moscow yesterday. And the meeting was also joined by the representatives of Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia and Turkey. And these representatives were present as guests. So the participants discussed issues pertaining to the present humanitarian crisis prevalent in Afghanistan, and also talked about an ongoing effort of various stakeholders to provide assistance to people in Afghanistan. They also discussed about formation of an inclusive and representative government in Afghanistan, efforts to counter threats of terrorism and also ensure regional security and peace and prosperity in Afghanistan. Further, the participants expressed a consolidated demand for complete unfreezing of Afghanistan's asset by Washington. The participants also urged United States and other NATO allies that were part of 20-year-long military presence in Afghanistan to compensate the Afghan people for the damage which has been done by them during this period. Now, an interesting fact with respect to this meeting was that no Taliban representatives were present in this meeting held yesterday. So this news mainly becomes important from your prelims perspective, and this topic gets covered under current events of international importance. Now let's take up this news appearing on page number 1 and also on page number 10, which mentions about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Now this news says that at COP27, India and 3 others oppose this carbon border tax. So this tax has been proposed by European Union, and it intends to tax such products such as steel or cement that are extremely carbon intensive. Now, carbon intensity is a measure of how clean our electricity is, and it refers to the number of grams of carbon dioxide released in the atmosphere to produce 1 kilowatt hour of electricity. So electricity which is generated using fossil fuels is more carbon intensive, as the process by which it is generated creates carbon dioxide emissions. So in this sense, this carbon border adjustment tax, which is proposed to be imposed by European Union, is a duty or tax on import for such products which is based on the amount of carbon dioxide emissions resulting from production of the product in question. So such a tax has both environmental impact, as it is a price on carbon or carbon emission and overall discourages carbon emission, but there is a negative economic impact, as this might act as a trade related barrier and it may affect production and also exports of certain goods such as cement and steel. So the next question is that who is opposing this border tax and why? So this border tax is being opposed by India and 3 other countries who are part of a group or consortium named as BASIC, which includes Brazil, South Africa and China along with India. And all these 4 countries are large economies that are significantly dependent on coal. And since they are significantly dependent on coal, hence they are more carbon intensive as compared to other countries or as compared to other developed countries who are not so much dependent on coal. And since these countries are largely dependent on coal for their electricity production, Hence, these countries can be said to be more carbon intensive due to more carbon dioxide emissions. So BASIC as a group of countries over the last several years have voiced common concerns and has reiterated the right to use fossil fuel during their country's eventual transformation to clean energy sources. Further, the BASIC countries have also expressed grave concern that developed countries were not showing leadership or responding with a matching effort. Further, the BASIC countries have also accused the developed countries of shifting of responsibilities, which is unfair and unilateral. So it says that the BASIC countries calls for a united solidarity response by developing countries to any unfair and unilateral shifting of responsibilities from developed to developing countries. So the BASIC countries are saying that even the developed countries which has used coal for number of centuries should also be held responsible. Further, the BASIC countries have stated that the developed countries are not only backtracking on their pledges but are also adopting double standards, as they are also presently using coal as a form of energy. So it says that developed countries has backtracked on finance and mitigation commitments and also pledges, and there was a significant increase in the consumption and production of fossil fuels in the past year by developed countries. So they are also being carbon intensive. So the BASIC country says that such double standards are incompatible with climate equity and justice. So overall, the BASIC countries have said that the developed countries are being unfair, as the idea of a carbon border tax has been designed unilaterally and tends to be seen unfair by the trading partners. And it also promotes green protectionism or adds green barriers to trade. So the concerns of the BASIC country is that this carbon border tax can become a protectionist device which is unduly shielding local industries from foreign competition in the name of so-called green protectionism. So it has been argued that green protectionism can be used to favor developed countries at the cost of developing countries, and they can also act as a barriers to trade for developing countries. So regarding the impact of green barriers to trade, it says that environment is increasingly being used to justify protectionist measures that enjoy greater social legitimacy. And in the last few years, new issues have emerged in relation to this example, such as green growth and green economy, climate change response measures, and liberalization of environmental goods and services. And these new issues pertaining to green barriers of trade are being used to apply barriers to goods and services coming from developing countries, and also to improve market access of developed countries' exports of industrial products. So for the developing countries, it is acting as a barrier to trade, and for the developed countries, it is facilitating trade. And this effectively amounts to green protectionism, which is aimed at improving trade balance of developed countries, particularly in relation to developing countries. So effectively, it facilitates trade for the developed countries and at the same time acts as a barrier for developing countries. And hence these taxes cannot be said to be designed at equal terms. And that is why the developing countries are opposing this carbon border tax. Thus, this article basically becomes important from your prelims perspective under the section of environment. So with this, we come to an end to today's discussion. Thank you for watching DNS. And if you like our effort, then please like the video, subscribe to our channel, and also press the bell icon so that you never miss any video lessons from Rao's IAS.